Then Jesus again, groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone laid against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there is stench, for he has been dead 4 days." And Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Then he took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." Now, when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth!" And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to him, "Loose him and let him go."
This is a story about life and death and life. And I guess one of the reasons this story seems pertinent to me right now is that in the past 12 days I have attended or participated in 3 different memorial services or funerals for people related to our church family. And yesterday it was my own brother-in-law, Jack Raines. And so these kinds of issues have been on my mind quite a bit lately, and I know on some of your minds as well. And also this being the season of Lent, as we approach the time of Jesus' death, this episode is occurring near the end of his life. And John records it here in his gospel. And it's a long story, and that's why we kind of broke it up into sections. And I'm going to kind of highlight that as I go through, but rather quickly, maybe not highlighting every detail. But we have Lazarus, who was the brother of Mary and Martha, and they all were friends of Jesus, evidently close friends of Jesus. He visited in their home on regular occasions. They lived at Bethany, which was about 2 miles from Jerusalem. And then as this story opens, Jesus is kind of out of town. It says across the Jordan, actually out of the country. And one reason for that is people are threatening him. It is the point at which there's resistance to Jesus. And he and the disciples have just stayed away for a while. But he is informed while there that his friend Lazarus is ill. And his response seems kind of strange. He says, "This is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through his illness." And then he doesn't really do anything. He doesn't rush back to help. It says he stays 2 more days in the place where he was. And finally, then he tells his disciples that he's going to Judea, back to the area of Jerusalem, to Bethany. And they protest. They say, "Lord, it's not safe. There are people there who want to kill you." And Jesus replies, "But I need to go." And at that point, he is straight with them and says, "Lazarus has died. And it's okay, because I wasn't there earlier. This will be an opportunity to increase your faith." And so they're not so sure about this. And Thomas, who we know doubted that Jesus was raised later on, is also apparently a bit pessimistic because he says, well, if he's going, we might as well go along and die with him. And they did. And when they arrived at the home of Lazarus and his sisters, he was told that Lazarus actually had been dead for 4 days. And that's significant because of a Jewish understanding that the spirit stays around the body for 3 days and then departs. So if he's been dead 4 days, it's even the spirit has departed. It is an utterly hopeless case. And Martha then, when Jesus arrives, comes out to meet him and says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And how would you like to have that laid on you? It's kind of like it's almost your fault that he's dead. And then Mary comes out to meet Jesus, and she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Not just once, but twice. He has this guilt laid on him. But Jesus knows more. And then Mary began to weep, and all those around her were weeping. And it says that Jesus himself became greatly disturbed in his spirit, deeply moved, emotionally moved at a deep level, and he also began to weep. Now the Message version of this uses another word, and I think it's curious. It says a deep anger welled up within him. And I don't know how they translated that as anger, but in one way that might be appropriate because anger is often one of the emotions we experience when someone close to us has died. You know, we have a whole range of emotions from distress, sorrow, mourning, weeping, but anger might be a part of that. So many emotions that affect us when a loved one passes away. Now, we're not used to relating to Jesus on such an emotional level. We usually don't read about him reacting from his emotions. And yet, I think this story provides a wonderful example of how Jesus truly was human. He was weeping. He was weeping probably for several reasons. He was weeping because he had lost a very close friend, a personal friend, Lazarus. And grief, weeping, that's a natural response. We're sad. And secondly, he was also experiencing this deep emotional pain because he was sharing the loss of his friends, the sisters, Mary and Martha. And he saw the other people weeping and the sadness that was there, and that caused him to have empathy for them, knowing how grief-ridden they were. So Jesus was sad. Jesus was weeping. And I think that's, that just should be something very helpful to us in our times of distress, our times of grief. It should give us comfort because to know that Jesus could also experience sadness and grief at the time of a death of someone near him. We can be assured that Jesus also feels our pain, our sadness, as we go through those times ourselves. That when we weep, Jesus weeps with us. The people who were around saw Jesus weeping, and they were likewise surprised at this outward display of emotions. And they said, "See how much he loved his friend Lazarus." But then there were others, and this is often the case as well, who had a different reaction. They said, well, if he could open the eyes of a blind man, which he had done just 2 chapters before, then he certainly could have kept this man from dying. Why didn't he do something? That's sometimes the way people react too. Why didn't you do more? Why didn't Why didn't you help? What have you done for me lately? Sometimes people are always expecting more of us than we can deliver. And Jesus experienced that certainly as well. And then you have Mary and Martha, both of whom had the same greeting when they saw Jesus, when they said, Lord, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died, or maybe you could have prevented his death. And I guess we can sort of excuse them because they certainly were grief-stricken, and they may not have been thinking real clearly, or they may not have been real courteous because of the grief that they were under. But still, at some level, they were saying, Lord, it's your fault, or it's partly your fault that he's dead, that you didn't do something to stop it. Grief can cause us to react in a lot of different ways. Maybe blaming other people, maybe blaming ourselves. I wish I had taken him to the doctor sooner. I wish I had. I regret. We have our regrets. If only you had been here. If only I could have said to them something that I didn't get to say. If only we had had more time together. If only. That is a natural response to the death of someone close to us. Now, what happened next could not even be imagined, because all of Mary and Martha's if only scenarios couldn't have anticipated what Jesus was going to do next. They took Jesus to the tomb. I guess, like we go to the cemetery to visit the grave of a loved one. So they just took Jesus and went there. And again, Jesus was greatly disturbed, or the message says, anger was again welling up within him. And in this case, the tomb would have been a cave in a hillside with a stone, a large stone, over the door to close it, to seal it. And Jesus said, take away the stone. And then he prayed, Father, thank you for hearing me, so that those standing here may believe that you have sent me. And then Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man walked out of the tomb with the grave clothes hanging from him. And Jesus said, unbind him, loose him, let him go. What a story. We say, impossible. We don't know what to do with that story. And naturally, we don't know what to do with that story. That is beyond our comprehension. Those who witnessed it certainly were amazed. And it says, because of what they saw with their own eyes, many believed. But if we continue to follow that story over the next few verses, after the part that was read today, we find that not everybody was so pleased with that or so impressed with that, because there were people out there saying, this Jesus has got to go. This is just too much. This was truly the beginning of the end of his life. There were forces at work that were demanding his death. Verse 53 says, so from that day on, they planned to put him to death. There might be another reason that Jesus was weeping there at the tomb. And that might be because he knew that his own death was near. We could say that he was also maybe weeping for himself as he anticipated what was to come. His own impending suffering and loss of life and loss of relationship with all those who he loved was at hand. This story is a foreshadowing, in literary terms, a foreshadowing of events that are about to happen. And we know that that's kind of how John wrote. He wrote on different levels. There's the surface level of the literal events, and then there's the deeper theological implications of that underneath. And so we have a story here that sounds, it's going to sound familiar a little later on. There's a tomb near Jerusalem. There's a cave with a stone rolled across the door, and then that stone is taken back, and then somebody comes out with grave clothes still on them. We're going to hear that story again in a few weeks about another person. A few chapters later in John, a few chapters later in all four Gospels, because that indeed is the highlight, the climax of the Gospel story. That's what it's all about when we gather on Easter Day. So this is not just a story about the death and resurrection of Lazarus, but it also is a story of preparation for the death and the resurrection of Jesus himself. And this season of Lent is a time in which we focus on such themes. The fact is, Jesus stepped willingly into that place of death. He says, the disciples said, when they heard he was going back to Jerusalem, they said, Judea, you can't go there. There are people who want to kill you. But it was there that life came from death for his friend Lazarus. And yet he knew that in going there, he was hastening his own death. Jesus could see the end of that story in a way that we could not, or the disciples could not. And that is why our hope is in him and not in ourselves. We cannot see very far down the road. We can only see the next potential disaster or terminal illness or death or something that we consider horribly frightening or sad, but we don't see beyond that very often. Jesus saw beyond that, from death to resurrection. Jesus said to Martha, your brother will rise again. And she said, yes, Lord, I know he's going to rise again on the last day. But Jesus said, I am the resurrection. Resurrection is happening. New life happens now. There are new things being born. New life is happening all around us. Do you believe that, Martha? The question for us also is, do we believe that? Do we believe in resurrection? And part of that is, yes, the ultimate resurrection, the eternal life of our loved ones who have departed this world, and the hope that we have for us. Yes. Do we believe that? That is the ultimate resurrection. But resurrection happens. We see it in the natural world. Have you noticed any daffodils this week? About 2 weeks ago, when was the last snow? I don't know if it was that long. It looked totally like winter. It was dead out there. There was no sign of life. We've experienced a lot of that the last few months. But now suddenly you get a few warm days. There's always that day in spring when you first notice, I see green out there. It's not just about St. Patrick's Day. There's that one day that the grass is green, or enough green. The willow trees, last week, that's when I first noticed it. The buds on the willow trees, and other trees. And you see those tulips coming up about that far. The crocuses have been out for a little while. They're the first harbingers of spring. The robins came back. There's these signs. There's signs of resurrection in the natural world. But there's signs of resurrection all around us. God is doing new things. God is at work. Hopefully, you're seeing it in your life. What is God resurrecting in you right now, in your life? What is God resurrecting in our church? You know, there's been talk lately about how can we be more effective in reaching out to our community. What are the real needs of people in this community, and how can we address those, either as our own church or in conjunction with other churches or other groups? Well, we don't have the answer to that, but something is happening. Something is bubbling up. Resurrection is happening. We have leadership team meeting Tuesday night. Maybe we'll talk about that some more. Maybe you'll pray about that some more. What do you see? What evidence of resurrection do you see? Jesus said, Lazarus, come out. Do we hear that call to us as well? That which is dead and hopeless within us, within our soul, within our heart. How do we see? Do we hear that call from Jesus? Come out. Come out of that tomb. Get those grave clothes off. Unbind him and let him loose. He's saying that to us as well. May we hear that call. May we hear that call. I used the title, Unbound and Let Go. I thought that was kind of strange, maybe enough to get people's attention and make you wonder. How are we being unbound and let go by the power of Jesus at work in us? Amen.